just we could give it a couple of minutes maybe. There's quite a few people that are registered that aren't here yet. And then I will give a quick introduction and then we get started properly. Okay. So. Yeah, so people still arriving in ones and twos. So just wait until everyone's here. Okay, maybe that's a good moment. It seems to be quieting down a bit. Right. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, everyone. In January this year, I think many of us breathed a sigh of relief after as the USA came to the end of a presidency that had threatened and impeded global climate change policy and oversaw the exacerbation of many environmental issues. And it was really good to see the new administration being very quick to reverse some of the most concerning decisions, and in particular by rejoining the Paris Agreement that was adopted at COP21 in 2015. But since then, there also may be some signs of changes at a slightly deeper level. Like a couple of weeks ago, I heard Kamala Harris use the term environmental justice. And I haven't done any proper research on this, but it really struck me as noteworthy that that term that has mainly been heard in the context of campaign rooms and activist meetings, that term is now being used at the highest levels of government. And thinking about environmental justice and climate justice, we often think of justice in the moral sense or in the ethical sense. But justice, of course, also refers to justice in the legal sense. And I think it's really interesting to see, to think about how the two relate to each other. So I'm really delighted to introduce Craig Segall, our speaker today. Craig's the Assistant Chief Counsel of the California Air Resources Board, visiting lecturer in climate law at the University of Edinburgh, and also visiting scholar at UCLA Law. So he's firmly in the legal side of justice definitions, and I'm sure he's got really interesting perspectives on that on that relationship. So he's been a leader in California's litigation against the Trump administration, and today he'll consider whether the US might now be prepared to alter its legal frameworks and to correct some of the environmental injustices that have been at the roots of the climate crisis. So Craig, thanks very much for being here today with us, and over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Karen, and I want to thank you and the Center for Climate Justice at GCU. I think the frame the center offers, thinking about, as you'll see in this talk, climate law as law of power and law of justice is just centrally important. So the work that GCU and the LLM students are doing, and the center as a whole, rather, is just incredibly important in terms of making this conversation about what a just future looks like, not just what a decarbonized future looks like. And of course, with the new administration, this is an important chance for US law in many ways to catch up with where the world is going, and to also help move us all forward in a way that I hope is done with humility, recognizing how far the US in some ways has to go relative, for instance, to the Scottish context. So what I'll do today is talk for about 40 minutes on where US law in particular has been, trying to generalize that to the global context and offer some thoughts on where it might go, recognizing that the US situation is in some ways novel, given its unusual legal system, but is in some ways, I think, generalizable to the challenges many of us face. And then, of course, we'll leave time for questions. I look forward to hearing from this group. So our core question at this moment really is, how do we move forward with very little time to spare? As we all know, global emissions reductions have to very much increase in pace if we are to have any hope of staying below 1.5 degrees C or even 2 degrees C. And as we all move toward aptly the Glasgow Conference of the Parties, this fall, this is a good time to think about the foundations we're building upon as we begin this globally ambitious pitch to move forward. And I think a theme that will run through this talk is that in many ways, although there are grounds for optimism on technological progress, we can be much more optimistic about decarbonization than we might be for democracy. And the larger question that I'm going to pose is, as we begin to pivot the law toward even more ambitious decarbonization and hence channel enormously concentrated global capital and power in that goal, how do we protect freedom and democracy as well? How do we do justice, not just do technological improvement? So the usual story of US law often elides those questions. The narrative tends to be one about technological change enabled by variously federal and cooperatively federal, which is to say subnational, state and local frameworks that drive capital investments to change essentially market behavior. So the story tends to begin with images like those on the left of the Cuyahoga River, which flows into the Great Lakes in Ohio, on fire, as it sometimes tended to be back before the modern environmental legal regime was put in place in the 1960s and 70s. And there it is now, rather gentrified, not totally clear if those apartments in the back are affordable, but clean, pleasant, open to those using it through this system that fundamentally doesn't challenge global capitalist frameworks, doesn't really push hard on deeper structural stories, but instead is one in which technological progress enabled through iterative cleaning of engine technology, of cleaning up discharges, of cleaning up power plants, results in a world that fundamentally looks, in terms of social order, like the world in which the river burned, but in which the river flows clean. And that usual story tends to get extended into the future. And I think one way of telling it might be, look, we had this 4 years of industry capture of government under the Trump administration, successfully resisted by non-governmental organizations, states and local governments. And now, we move forward ineluctably toward a technologically enabled better future in which inevitably costs continue to fall through clean technology, emissions continue to fall, and we carry on much as before, albeit under greater climate disruption, without really having to revisit core assumptions of our legal frameworks. Instead, it's about the day-to-day work of administration. And I should say this usual story sometimes has sort of a more naturalistic prequel. These two fellows, they're US President Teddy Roosevelt, looking stout and hearty there in Yosemite National Park, and John Muir, Scottish immigrant who was heavily involved in wilderness preservation as he saw it in the Western US. And this prequel story essentially suggests that in the early days coming out of the Industrial Revolution and the US's massive Western conquest and expansion, there's this effort to recognize natural systems as worthy of preservation. And that backdrop then gets wedded to the technological story to suggest a forward progress that's, again, rooted heavily in sort of a mix of aesthetics and technical progress. In essence, sort of combining late 50s, early 60s techno-optimism with sort of late Victorian, Edwardian, aesthetic preferences and hopes for spiritual success in the outer sublime, kind of a Wordsworthian notion, straight from the Lakes District to Yosemite National Park, as the story of the law. And again, all these stories, although they are about resource extraction and energy production and use, fundamentally are rooted in a mix of technocratic governance. And to the degree they're place-based, are often very much about the aesthetics of particular places. Generally speaking, wild places, rocky places, places covered with ice, far from where people actually live. And to the degree we're talking about environmental quality in individual cities, that conversation is very much about sort of day-to-day lived experience as we clean up various sources. And I think what I want to suggest is that as we move forward toward what looks like much more wholesale structural change, whether we like it or not, under climate disruption, as we think about wildfire and flood, but as we think more to the point about really large-scale climate migration across what have been closed and in the US recently walled off national borders. And as we think about the actual landscapes of lived experience under the current regime, there's an important missing element to this story that's missing both in terms of its narrative and in terms of its legal construction, which is a really deep focus both on the far fraughter history of the last century and of distributive justice worked in law. So what the story leaves out really is whose environment, who's experiencing the environment, and how can the law justly recognize these questions. So I want to begin with another picture, and I know this is a grim one, of about the same period, perhaps a few decades prior to Muir and Roosevelt standing on their rock. And this is Wounded Knee in the Dakotas, shortly after a US Army massacre of the Sioux Nation there, largely women and children, at their winter camp. And the point of this shocking image isn't just to shock, it's to point out that this narrative of uninterrupted progress is occurring against a really different background. As the Native scholar Dina Gilio Whitaker puts it in her book on sort of Native sovereignty and environmental justice, people sometimes construct the future of climate law as warding off apocalypse. But a more accurate frame, especially in the Americas, might be that we already live in a post-apocalyptic landscape in which millions have died over the course of a 500-year conquest, marked by successive waves of slave trade, conquest, national disintegration, and profound conversion of the national landscape, which remains heavily embedded in law. It is still true in US law that the tribal nations are treated with a large degree of condescension, essentially with their land and resources held in trust for them as if they weren't competent to govern. And with the US's sort of partially colonized possessions, ranging from its possessions in the Philippines to the Pacific to Puerto Rico, essentially as justified under laws, racially inferior groups not entitled to full rights under a group of cases called the insular cases from the US Supreme Court, which have never been overruled. And so the point here is that the possession of resources and the implications of that are actually deeply tied up in questions of empire, questions of conquest, and to the degree we're talking about preventing apocalypse, we might more meaningfully ask the degree to which our laws are rooted in a reconstruction of resource management that takes place in a narrative of ongoing apocalypse and indeed cultural survival and reconstruction, not just of the native nations of the Americas, but now as the world once again confronts these structures in all the peoples of the world, in which that neat narrative of preserved wild spaces and technological progress really deserves questioning. I'll note in this regard that Yosemite, where Muir and Roosevelt are standing, was in fact the possession, of course, of a native nation, which Muir essentially described as unsightly. Its landmarks now are often named for folks who survived US Army massacres within the park. And viewing that, frankly, is really important to extend this environmental law narrative both backwards and forwards as we consider what it addresses and what it leaves out. Similarly, much of the story of technological process has to be viewed against the background of racial and economic segregation across the United States and indeed the world. In the US context, this practice tends to get called redlining. Essentially, this was a state-sponsored practice, largely growing out of the World War II period, in which even as de jure segregation by race was formally being dismantled, a replica system was set up in the context of property law, in which the US government would only provide home loans to areas deemed as low risk, which were generally areas inhabited by members of the white middle class and the burgeoning middle class after World War II. The result of this is still profoundly visible on the US landscape, as it is in the redlined areas, that is, the minority and immigrant communities, through which highways were driven with continued pollution impacts today, and in which the vast majority of heavily polluting industrial sources were cited, which is to say that although individual legal frameworks cleaning up individual sources may produce individually quite good results, the cumulative impacts felt by these laws are profoundly different for completely intentional reasons. These racial impacts are baked into the system against which these seemingly neutral regimes operate. a way of saying this is that the US's greatest environmental president continues to be Richard Nixon, the Republican president of the 1970s, under which the entire modern statutory pollution regime was constructed, with perhaps its second greatest environmental leader being President H.W. Bush, who sponsored the Cleaner Act amendments of 1990. And it's worth noting the historical context in which this regime is erected. You know, the US statutory regime is largely constructed out of the disappointments and reconstruction of the 1960s social movements in the US. And it is, in many ways, I think, reflective of a time of considerable social churn, elite concern for what that would mean for elite neighborhoods, and one, and this is important, of broad economic equity relative to today's standards, at least among the white middle class elite. In this frame, there was very little consensus among the political and legal elites that shape law for looking at distributive consequences. For groups outside of the dominant power structure, there's limited political power within these largely right-wing ascendancies, but even within the left-wing movements that are moving the statutes, there's a combination of racism, race blindness, and large faith in continued social progress coming out of the World War II generation. It results in an environmental framework that heavily buys into the stories I've told you at the beginning of the talk, which is to say, stories of continued technological progress in which we needn't really attend to distributive equity. Instead, it's a theory of technocratic governance that poses the question for environmental progress, not really in terms of this landscape of contested power and landscape I've described, but instead in terms of how technocratic governance through new agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency can be worked out one engine at a time. And indeed, and this is an important point, that turns out not to be an entirely bad frame. In fact, as these charts suggest, and these are just showing first on the pollution side, pollution drops just since 1990 in the US, and costs and benefits, including measured health outcomes. There is enormous progress in this frame. So this is not a claim I'm making that these statutes fail, quite to the contrary. You see enormous drops in air pollution, water pollution, et cetera, across the country. And to some degree, that rising tide does float all boats. Indeed, in the communities that have been most impacted by what is functionally racist siting decisions, you see considerable progress, arguably slower, but still improvements, which creates, I think, ongoing political and legal space to sort of suggest that this is a continuing right regime. And indeed, as we consider decarbonization, we've seen a very similar model in the US in which the question is much more focused on how to cost effectively decarbonize, how to sort of move on, rather than ever wrestling with the deep questions until fairly recently. It's not to say that many, many voices aren't raising those questions, but within the mainstream of legal formation, they're to some degree ancillary. They're outside of scope, I think it tends to be how they get described. The result, of course, are equally enormous gaps commensurate with this progress. This image is of the Flint, Michigan water treatment plant, where there's one of many instances of disadvantaged communities being left out by this focus and this sort of technocratic market narrative to the law, in which the drinking water simply isn't safe. So there's this simultaneous disinvestment in public infrastructure over this period. And I mean that in a broad sense. This lack of concern with distribution coincides with the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions in the US and the UK, and continued dismantling of the larger welfare states. So while the air and water may be getting cleaner, there's also growing economic precarity and growing disinvestment, not just in the physical infrastructure of the country, but in its social infrastructure and the shared consensus to address larger distributive gaps that is in some ways papered over by the continued technological progress. So you have the story of cleaner tech combined with social decay, along with some problems that are never wholly addressed, in part because they have this distributive framework. This is perhaps particularly visible, for instance, in agricultural systems in which agriculture continues to be much less regulated in the environmental frame than almost any other industry. coupled with a continued, somewhat two-sided, oddly schizoid approach in the law in which the US both tries to keep out the migrant workers who largely power the system, while both depending upon them and insisting on failing to care for their health. So in the same way that the US fails to do any sort of serious COVID protections for migrant workers during the most recent pandemic, it largely fails to account for farm worker health in its occupational safety regime and in pesticide management. A growing problem, of course, is climate change makes working outside in heavy protective gear ever more difficult. So they're in areas where the environmental infrastructure bumps up against this decaying labor and social infrastructure, you see these continued gaps where a combination of regulatory capture and a disinclination to look at distributory consequences results in either retrenchment of progress or much slower progress than you might see in areas of more direct technological progress, where even there, of course, industry is pushing back, but you have a much sort of steadier technological upward ratchet. This is also, of course, painfully true with regard to land use. Somewhat ironically, President Nixon did plan a national land use regulatory regime. I believe the statute would used to be called, unfortunately, NLUPA, in the 1960s and 70s, but managed to get himself impeached before it was enacted. So we have Watergate to owe to the US not having anything that looks like national land use planning, but instead a legacy system of largely single family zoning that excludes dense housing in urban areas near transit, combined with intense land speculation on urban margins, which is generally speaking enhanced the pattern of segregation we've already seen, with continued, as a result, political and legal resistance to dealing with land use. A considerable problem, for instance, in the context of vehicle emissions, in which even quite strict regulations on new vehicles will fail to substantially quickly reduce, or at least sufficiently quickly reduce, existing vehicle emissions, given the need to drive all through the US, given the lack of sufficient rail infrastructure, the continued dependence on this sort of land use model. This finally, and I'll continue with the bad news for a bit more before we pivot to the good news and opportunities, has been combined with the US's odd presidentialist legal structure, which is designed fundamentally for gridlock, made substantially worse by the founders' inability to anticipate party politics, meaning that it's possible to have wholesale legislative capture, which of the last 30 years has meant there's been really no major federal environmental legislation can measure the scale of all these crises, especially not the climate crisis. This problem combines with a real crisis in democracy, in which the sheer non-representativeness of the US Senate, in which the state of California with 40 million people gets the same 2 senators as the state of Wyoming with 700,000 people, resulting in what has functionally been minority rule. To give you a sense of this, the last few Republican presidents have been elected with a strong popular minority of the vote, but have appointed the vast majority of the US Supreme Court, meaning that increasingly the US is a jurisdiction that fails to follow majoritarian democratic precepts, such that even though a strong majority of US citizens support action on all these issues, it is exceptionally hard to move those through the US Senate, in which now, even now, the 50 Democratic senators represent millions more people than the 50 Republican senators, but nonetheless have to manage gridlock. This, I think, leaves us with the challenge that's familiar to all of us, which is this growing authoritarianism. Whether it's Donald Trump in the US, Narendra Modi in India, Xi Jinping in China, we've seen democratic retrenchment. We've seen continued skepticism of democratic rule and frustration in this sort of context of global long emergency and crisis, which means that solving these problems, of course, gets steadily harder to the degree that folks can buy into the idea that democracy fundamentally cannot solve their problems. So all of this, overlies these challenges. So what can we do about it? Well, there are positive signs. Some of the challenges here have been addressed, I think, with the sort of pressure at the federal level through subnational action. One of the major consequences of the Trump years, and indeed the Obama years with their various failures, has been increasing development of a very strong subnational NGO alliance across a range of issues that increasingly focuses on issues of intersectional justice and that asks these questions at multiple levels of legal rule and scale. Because after all, in the US, the federal structure is far less dominant than subnational structures, in the same way that Scottish devolution has left the Parliament in Holyrood with significant jurisdiction beyond that of the Parliament in Westminster. There's been a thickening of civil society, sort of in response to the thinning that has occurred, sort of as a legacy of the Reagan-Thatcher years. And that thickening you really see in a whole wide range of instances in which polycentric actions the answer. One way of phrasing this is that in the failure of US climate legislation in the early Obama years has been met with a success in increasingly networked subnational local governments and NGOs, all of them cheerfully, fractiously arguing their way into what looks like a thicker movement-based community that may be more able to resist retrenchment. And indeed, in the Trump years, we've seen progress continue across the US and across the world, despite these efforts at consolidation, driven, of course, by active dissent that finds its way both into purely legal channels of dissent and extra legal channels, whether that's in the burning of police stations during the George Floyd protests in Minneapolis that then seeded a wave of legal responses, to the occupation of pipeline building sites in the Dakotas not far from Wounded Knee, as folks insisted that the legal regime fundamentally had to change. This leaves us then with obviously a fraught landscape, one in which we can tell a story of very considerable legal progress, but also in which these larger social challenges built on unstable foundations leave us with a future that I'll characterize as one in which freedom and climate progress may decouple. It's clear initially that despite the claims of people, say like Naomi Klein, who's written these notions that the only way out of the climate crisis is a challenge to global capitalism, I'd say that's obviously incorrect. Here's US inequality. It looks a lot like global wealth inequality from Thomas Piketty's research, in which the 1% steadily capture more wealth. At the exact same time, we're seeing this sort of technological progress. This is battery storage. I could chart similar charts on renewable energy, on electric vehicles, on essentially all the technology needed. There similar growth curves now beginning on carbon capture, direct air capture, and the like. The point being that global concentrations of capital are entirely comfortable with shifting into new green technology. They may drag their feet. One might expect the oil supermajors to resist until they've captured as much income off their current reserves as possible. But in the end, consider how in the North Sea, the same oil companies that had the expertise to build those oil rigs probably now have the expertise to build the piping systems needed to capture carbon dioxide and the expertise needed to build offshore wind. There's just no clear reason to suppose that sort of a utopian vision of, say, green villagers, always sort of inadequately, fuzzily sketched with distributed community power, are going to be more able to drive this shift toward a decarbonized economy than the current massive capital conurbations if they're appropriately regulated. And of course, there's evidence for this historically. This is J.P. Morgan belaboring a journalist about the head and neck with his umbrella, who's approached him doubtless to raise objections to Morgan's capture of the global oil industry back in the 1900s. That era of robber barons is, of course, an era of energy transition. Then as now, US law didn't particularly consider distributive consequences. Then as now, the US was recovering from massive both racial and civil unrest after the Civil War. And then as now, wealth equality was enormously unequally distributed. And then as now, an energy transition is going on. At that time, from water and horses and animal power and human power to increasingly industrialized assembly line power, electrical power. But there's nothing about that transition that required social democracy. If anything, that transition pushed away from it. And what I want to say is that's not different now. Just as quasi-authoritarian states like China are rapidly moving into green technology, and the sort of quasi-tech libertarian you see from people like Elon Musk, who's built his company, in fact, on government mandates, but a company with a dreadful labor record, you see active resistance, whether it's in the authoritarian regimes to democratic control, whether it's in the sort of tech libertarian Western regime to labor power and distributive justice. you don't need democracy to build a cheap battery, and you don't need distributive justice to do in power. If anything, hyperconcentration of wealth may move you along faster. What that means then is that if we're going to think about climate law as climate justice, that we should be thinking of it not as a law of engines and batteries, but as a law of power. With all the fraught consequences and all the negotiation and intersectional debates that implies. And that is where perhaps we have a chance in the US as we recover, I hope, from our own brush with authoritarianism, and rather a deep brush it is, considering the history I've just laid out, to begin thinking about new ways to rebuild the law. And I will note, given our federal legal paralysis, much of this is likely to have to be done in subnational jurisdictions and through regulatory measures to the degree that without rebuilding legislative democracy in the US, this will continue to be a challenge. So what sort of opportunities out there? Well, some are just flatly distributional analysis. This is an example from California, but there's similar examples ordered by the Biden administration now to be built nationally, looking at a much finer degree of resolution at where and how communities experience pollution. These sorts of data-based exercises can be paired with changes in governance and enforcement. So this is Cancer Alley in Louisiana, one of the densest concentrations of refineries and chemical industry in the US. As I've noted, permitting each one of those myriad smokestacks individually to be clean as it can be fundamentally ignores the overall cumulative impact problem. And there are real legal efforts now afoot to change this. The state of New Jersey, for instance, has just passed world-leading legislation, basically looking at these cumulative impacts that actually changes this permitting framework and asks not, is any individual smokestack clean, but how do we move a whole region toward cleanness? In California, where obviously I have considerable experience, there's similar efforts through the Office of Community Air Protection, which was created as part of a package of bills in the last couple of years to similarly look at community level protection in this way. That's an opportunity that's workable at the federal level as well through enforcement initiatives and combinations of work across federal agencies and subnationals without new statutes, which is really important considering the paralysis I've described. There's similar opportunities for industrial policy, both to address the sorts of economic precarity that can otherwise result in labor alliances with existing polluting industry. You know, imagine how workers working at a coal-fired power plant at a refinery have a completely legitimate interest in protecting their jobs, or say workers looking grimly at the combination of automated vehicles and electrical vehicles might raise legitimate questions about how the last few labor unions in trucking will fare if we move just only to an electrified future without considering labor. So there's room here to look at things like decommissioning plans at the community levels, at the subnational level, and perhaps ultimately at the national level, combined with real efforts to reform trade unionism for a gig economy era, and indeed to drag us back from the disastrous gig economy, which is of course the same kind of part work one might have expected from the JP Morgan era. It's not a new innovation that techs come up with. It's the same innovation that we had before we had decent union labor law. And so in many ways, climate law that can address industrial change at the scope we're talking about has to not be facile or disingenuous about some possible future nexus of green jobs, but has to reckon with the reality that the same capital forces that are investing in decarbonization will, of course, be more than happy to shed labor costs if allowed to do so, meaning that rather than just gesturing at job creation, one has to deal both with retraining, but also the reality that some folks working in the current sectors simply are not going to be reemployed in a wholly different sector, instead require the sort of social democracy and welfare states now present to some degree in the European nations and that are woefully tattered in the US. In this sense, the Biden era's focus on extending healthcare may be as important to climate policy as anything it can do on engines. Likewise, a real focus on paying carers and looking at the gendered nature of work that leaves many folks wholly dependent on an ever-shifting network of gig work is critical to creating political room to move these changes. Similarly, there will be a need to think about transition planning that changes networks of capture. This is a refinery on fire in the Bay Area, as it tends to do. this is an example of a community, largely African-American and Hispanic, created in part by redlining after World War II, that is now heavily dependent on oil refinery emissions, in which some of these community transition programs I've discussed are now operating, which in part work by scrambling traditional networks of power and creating new vertical networks, whether it's new community leaders who are able to speak directly to state leaders, new collaborations amongst federal leaders and community leaders and so on, to engage in processes that traditional environmental law is quite resistant to. You know, asking a question, where do we want to go as a community, rather than what is the cleanest way to build this refinery boiler. So it's to ask the question that obviously is incumbent upon all of us: how do we get to a zero carbon future that is just and supported by the communities that have experienced the past high carbon future as sacrifice zones, instead of affirmatively choosing to empower these communities as partners, indeed as leaders in the process? That again is something that can be done largely regulatorily, largely through choices about how one structures public participation that may be as basic as having meetings in the evening when working people can get them, as providing childcare and food at those meetings, is recognizing that there are populations of people who have been wholly left out of government, whose experience of government is nonetheless one that can be far more positive than it has been if we look firmly at the cracked foundations in which we are building. Governance reform, this again is an image from California showing the many communities that are now being engaged directly in this sort of starting process, in which the Brookings Institution has found could be replicated nationally and internationally as a real model for looking at the gaps in these legal regimes that have been far too regional, far too national, far too technologically focused, without looking at the lived economic experience. In other words, looking where Presidents Nixon and H.W. Bush may not have wanted to look, at the lived experiences of those in between the engines and smokestacks, dependent on jobs there, but also experiencing the asthma, the heartache that comes with living in communities that have been neglected by a structure that politically and legally was designed not to see them. And I think that is just critical in thinking about this as a democratic design problem rather than just a technology problem. This gets us to this idea of polycentric governance. So this, in her truly amazing poncho, is Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate in economics. To dilate briefly, Ostrom's core insight was that we focused far too much on competition and this notion of sort of technological capture, and far too little on collaboration in economics. It is perhaps, everyone knows the phrase tragedy of the commons, which is coined by an environmental studies professor called Garrett Hardin. Fewer know that Garrett Hardin was an active funder of white supremacist groups and an anti-immigration activist, frankly, dreadful racist who constructed the story of the tragedy of the commons consistent with a larger effort to fence the commons off for people like Garrett Hardin. Ostrom spent much of her career pointing out that collaborative management and community management of environmental resources, not the sort of 1960s era fear of a population explosion, generally categorized as brown people somewhere else having too many babies, was not in fact a problem, but that the racist frame that minimized community management of resources was the problem. And her efforts to document this, in particular in the context of climate change, ultimately won her the Nobel Prize, although I'm afraid not yet enough influence in environmental policy. But I would note that this notion of polycentrism, of community control, of there being no one right lever to move the world, is in many ways beginning to show up in our law, whether it's in things like these community governance efforts that I've mentioned, in the subnational networks that I've mentioned, working around and through national policy, but indeed even in the structure of the Paris Agreement, which, frustratingly or not, ultimately abandoned a totalizing central market frame that the Kyoto Protocols had offered 20 years prior, and instead put its faith in fractious democratic debate, sometimes among elites, sometimes among communities, to create many different nationally determined contributions to the ongoing effort to control climate change. So I guess what I'd offer is, when we think about the path forward, the hope is to think about people like Ostrom and less about people like Hardin, that there is a comedy of the commons, a happiness to the shared work of governance that offers us a chance to resist narratives of zero-sum scarcity, that invites us to think about not resilience, not simply rebuilding the structures we've done, but anti-resilience. This Shalanda Baker, who's recently been appointed to the US Department of Energy, talks about, of dismantling unjust structures, not just making them cleaner. And here's a literal dismantling. There are opportunities in land sovereignty. This is the Navajo Nation taking down its coal-fired power plant, which is now replacing with solar and wind, a fraught debate, right? Considering the many jobs they had. This plant largely provided the pollution to the Navajo and the power to the state of California. And a combination of subnational action, collaboration, tribal leadership, and ongoing debates are beginning to chart out a green future here that in part, again, is designed to move us forward by embracing the leadership of those who own their own communities. And there's also obviously a huge need to think about what community means in the context of a coming era of multi-million person climate migration, in which walls will fundamentally fail us. So when we think about climate law from this perspective, that includes things like finding ways to welcome folks moving north, largely as a result of the policies of the global north, whether it's across the Mediterranean or across the Rio Grande, in ways that can welcome the long human tradition of migration that's obviously been carrying on since humans left the Great Rift Valley and carried on their way into the rest of the world. So thinking seriously, not about a series of technocratic fortresses, but of fluid communities, I think is really critical to framing a climate law consistent with the disruptions we're facing, in one that can resist the sort of populist nationalism that has characterized, the Trump era of climate law. That is an invitation, in other words, to democracy protection, in which thinking seriously about ways to resist gerrymandering, to resist minority rule of government, and to embrace popular rule in a real way is critical. This is a tension. As I've said, increasingly the US has relied on executive branch agencies, which are not directly elected, for progress given legislative stasis. But I will say that I think that situation is ultimately unstable. As we've seen the retrenchment from Obama to Trump, and now the enormous resource cost of rebuilding regulations under Biden, the answer has to be in empowering legislative majorities. And there one might see, for instance, the major difference between the UK and Scotland's response to climate change, in which parliamentary rule has allowed majorities to rapidly make progress, and the US's halting response, in which an inability to make legislative law consistently results in a fraught back and forth between the legislature, regulatory agencies, and courts. Conservative judges, in particular, right-wing judges, increasingly tend to invalidate regulatory actions on the theory that the executive agencies are overreaching and the legislature should have acted. Well, at the same time, the Roberts Court in the US, the Supreme Court, wholly fails to protect democracy, refusing to correct gerrymandering, refusing to correct campaign finance reform, with the result that it becomes ever harder to manage legislative reform. Might see this sort of talking out both sides of one's mouth. So the suggestion here is that focusing deeply on majoritarian governance is ultimately a really critical way of getting beyond this sort of technocratic democracy legitimacy trap. I'll close by saying that what I'm ultimately proposing is, as always, an older story than one thinks in environmental law. We do have a tradition, both in Western philosophy and law, of course, in many other traditions as well, but this just happens, the sort of irascible Jewish tradition is one of which I'm a part, of reacting to efforts to think about authoritarianism clearly. That's in people like Karl Popper and Hannah Arendt here, who in the post-World War II generation attempt to build, a philosophy of muddling through, right? One that doesn't ask for totalizing visions, one that is rooted much more in the messy work of politics and compromise and grappling with the ugliness of our history, and much less in assuming that environmental law somehow exists in a wholly apolitical frame in which we can just carry on attaching scrubbers to smokestacks without asking where those smokestacks are, who built them, where the fuel came from, and where the emissions are going. I think embracing that grounding is one way to begin filling in these cracks in our foundations and asking how we can build not just this green future, one that is rooted in a technocratic progress that will, I think, be wholly happy to ignore that democracy, to ignore community. And so squarely no, this vision that it's all just hinges together and we all carry along together is wrong, that this is politically contested terrain, that it is legally contested terrain, and that our job is to work in politics. And this is where I'll close. Our question is, which sort of future? And I've brought us back to the Dakotas. This is the protest, against the Dakota Access Pipeline. in which the water defenders, the tribes who owned the land after all, and their allies faced off the whole mechanics of the state in all its military force, not much more than a century after the Wounded Knee massacre that happened not far away. And what I'm going to suggest is that the real story we're in the US is that story, a story in which contestation over resources, over the control of peoples and communities, is the story that emerges from the US's legacy of conquest, of discrimination, but also of its better story, of the communities and people who have resisted that narrative, not just by truth-telling, but by active popular resistance, by legal reform and litigation, by insistence on the work of democracy, whether that's direct protest and confrontation with the mechanics of an unjust law, or forming more just law through the muddling through the daily work of it all that occupies regulatory agencies and judges and legislatures and courts. And that if we're to build firmly as we enter this new administration, it's embracing that legacy, the deeper story of environmental law that's about power and its management and its insistence on freedom that's going to get us further. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions. I appreciate the chance to talk with you all.
Now, I'll give you a quick demo. I should be able to.
Okay. Thanks very much, Craig. Sorry, there was some microphone switched on there. That threw me a bit. That was really interesting, and it raised lots of issues. I kind of realized at the beginning I should probably have introduced myself and the background to the center a little bit. So just very, very briefly, I'm Karen Helwig. I'm the leader of the MSc Climate Justice at GCU. And this event with our guest speaker, Craig Segall, was hosted by the GCU Center for Climate Justice. I think most of you probably know that anyway, but I thought I'd just mention it, as I probably should have done in the beginning. But I don't want to let that distract from the topic of conversation that we're on. And I think, yeah, just would like to invite anyone to raise your questions or concerns or comments or anything else. Would you like to respond to Craig? So please just raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself when I invite you to speak. Okay. Okay. I'm trying to see if I. Just a second. I've got no raised hands yet. Would anyone like to ask any questions to Craig or respond to what he's been talking about?
I thought it was really interesting. I'd never had the perspective that the whole thing had to be dismantled. So I'm new to the climate justice section, and yeah, I just thought that was a really compelling point to make. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thanks, Abigail. And I'd say, I think part of the question is not so much how we dismantle the whole edifice, given the way that everything's stacked on top of each other, but how you build on top of the inherent sort of contingency of the historical formation of the law, right? So one way of engaging it, and I'd be curious what you think, is how do you take the reality that your tools are always imperfect, but still build with them, right? Because it's not as if we could possibly sort of say, in the limited time remaining on climate change, that we have to just utterly start again. We don't have the time for that. But it is figuring out ways to sort out the law in ways that won't make it worse and that can recognize that we're contesting in multiple frames. But I'm curious what you think, Abigail.
Oh, honestly, it seems like a very complicated section to dive into. I wouldn't even know where to begin. So I'd need to come back to you with that kind of answer, but it would definitely get me thinking in the next couple of weeks with the climate justice module that I'm doing with Michael.
Oh, good. Well, I really appreciate you thinking about it.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Karen, I think there's a question in the chat.
Is there? Oh, wait. Oh, yeah. There's a question that says, what do you view the role of local governments should be in adopting meaningful environmental justice policies to interview both society and higher levels of policy?
I think it's quite central, I think, in several regards. I mean, I'd note that local governments, through things like multinational coalitions, have actually influenced even international policy quite strongly, given that good urbanism becomes really a critical question. I should say my wife works on that issue, so she'd know better than I. But I think the key issue really is so much of the experience of lived government is at the local level, right? You know, it's where you go to the council, it's whether or not they're going to collaborate. Say in the Trump regime, many cities refused to collaborate on immigration deportation, for instance. And it's in siting decisions. So I actually think that it can often be a mistake to look to the far off national government in terms of demanding justice, and that local government, which is generally more responsive, but often somewhat neglected, has a huge role to play. I mean, if you think about it in terms of lived experience, it matters a great deal whether or not there's an apartment complex next to the road, whether the road goes through, whether there are decent parks. In many ways, these are fundamentally local questions about the experience of place as much as they are about grand national politics. I'm not even sure they're different things. You know, it's like the world may be this sort of vast, you know, conurbation, but ultimately, as we all know, especially during the pandemic, we're all in our own particular rooms and spaces.
Thanks, Craig. We have a raised hand from Rick Allen. Rick, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. My wife and I worked at a food co-op in Santa Fe for 6 or 7 years. During that time, the co-op caught the wave of organic food and grew constantly without much effort. And the people who worked there, you know, we expanded the workforce. And over time, they're kind of, I don't know what happened exactly, but there became divisions within the groups. And eventually, because my wife and I were both very competent at our jobs, we rose and, you know, we became general managers as such. I mean, we had a group consensus kind of decision making, which I must say was very inefficient, but I guess it worked. What I guess I'm trying to say is, at the local level, it's very difficult and tedious often to try to get all this stuff working in the same direction. And eventually at the co-op, it failed on a democratic vote at a general meeting, you know, like 41 to 57. And eventually the co-op, because it just said, well, the workers are fine, they'll never do anything wrong, let's just not manage, you know, not put any Western management concepts into this business. It didn't work out, and that co-op doesn't exist anymore. So I'm just trying to say, I guess it's difficult to get down to that local level and make things work. And I'm not sure, I don't know what I'm saying. That's it. Thanks. Thanks, Craig.
Well, I hear that, Rick. I think one thing that's been, I think, deeply distressing for all of us working on this is there's this moment, maybe in your early 20s, when you sort of think there's just a way to fix it. And then you sort of realize with a sinking stomach, at least I know I do, that most experiences of government are somewhere between boring and awful in the day-to-day. People argue with each other. People are turfy. People didn't have lunch and they're always cranky before lunch. I mean, it is amazing how much everything from national policy to local policy turns a heck of a lot more on whether people can talk to each other than on, some dispassionate kind of Olympian debate about, what's the right policy answer. And I think where that can go is the sort of, either lack of faith in democracy or the sort of effort to charge forward in other ways. And you can see that writ large in efforts to like preempt, so you take away California's authority, we'll do it nationally, or, over vehicles, or even in local ways where people sort of walk away from the process. And I guess I want to say, basically, I think that, whether it's a co-op in New Mexico or a national parliament, part of the challenge is figuring out who gets to be in the room and ways to sort of make it viable. And I think one thing that can be really hard, especially for younger activists, is I think the feeling of democracy and of government is so often basically frustration. And it's really hard to figure out that the feeling of frustration can be the feeling of progress and that it's going to fail a lot. And that's not, and I think that can lead, I think about how the tech industry has insisted it's beyond politics. But what's really doing is replicating robber baron politics by saying they just don't want to talk to people. And that can get you pretty far in technology. But I think I'd rather live in a frustrated world than in Elon Musk's.
Thanks, Craig. We've got a question from Mary Holt in the chat saying, in addition to a subnational focus, how critical is a global government to affect change?
Well, I think that one of the lessons of Kyoto is global governance doesn't work as a totalizing system. And I think that the Paris lesson is that ultimately there may be shared global standards. I think about the International Labor Organization's green transition guidance and focus on decent work. I think about the International Migration Organization's efforts. So I think there are accountability and standard setting functions that are really important. But I actually think global government turns out to be a lot thicker than people think, by which I mean whether that's things like BlackRock, the US Investment Bank, insisting on climate standards for financial regulation, or global governance through networks of land defenders and protest, that in practice, it's about this sort of complicated, multi-layered framework rather than, some final dreamlike, totally politically unrealistic, global governance body. It's messy. It's necessarily messy. And I think that has two consequences. One is that the pace of decarbonization is going to be perhaps slower than it ought to be, which means we need to do a lot more thinking about how we protect people and populations. But also that in some ways, we need to be doing a lot more work on protecting democracies than we perhaps need to be worrying about just pure technology. And I think that's another lesson I take away from it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions right now or comments? Oh, we have someone else in the chat. Jessica says, will responding to climate change such as in Texas reduce the ability of local and state government to make climate progress?
So the Texas situation is a truly odd one. So Texas had cut itself off from the federal grid, largely to drive a fairly extreme capitalist version of energy regulation, so extreme market pricing. So a lot of the Texas failure has to do with less governance rather than more. And of course, a lot of what failed in Texas were natural gas-fired and coal-fired power plants whose fuel either froze, or in the gas context, one of the profound liabilities of gas-fired power is you're using natural gas for heat and for power, which means during a blackout, there's a competition between heating people's homes and powering them, which is ultimately untenable. So I think two near-term lessons from Texas. One is that regulation really, really, really matters, and that deregulatory regimes tend to be a challenge. I'd point out Professor Shelley Welton, who I believe is now at Pace Law School in New York, has pointed out that grid governance tends to be too technocratic, not think enough about democracy and decarbonization, which is a big problem here, right? If you're debating just reliability without thinking about worker protection or about the lived experience of those communities, you've got your governance wrong. And there's also a lesson in the residual strength of the fossil industry, right? I mean, you immediately saw this meme, which was actually from Sweden, of a wind turbine being defrosted in a test with a helicopter. And you have all these sort of Republican Congress people saying, ha, fossil fuels are necessary, wind turbines won't run, which one is factually wrong. The wind turbines ran fine, and wind turbines have de-icing and run fine, in the Arctic and Antarctic. But two, speaks to the degree of political capture, where people actually are acting in politics on this. And it's about incumbent industries hedging against risk and trying to prevent regulation. So I think, that lesson is the lesson we've commonly shared, which is as we confront ongoing disasters, as we will under climate destabilization, it will become even more important to insist on government and therefore insist on conversation, and also to resist the sorts of information capture that we've seen through the laxness of the social media companies allowing this sort of stuff to spread, and the continued investments in fossil companies in spreading this sort of propaganda.
Thank you. Let me check. Any more hands up just now? I can't see any. Does anyone else want to come in just now?
I think we've done it, Karen. We've solved all of global climate policy.
Yeah, I had a thought, Craig, as well. You've drawn attention to the fact that the popular vote isn't really represented in the power structures at the moment. Do you think that improving that situation would do enough to protect vulnerable people who are often minorities and sometimes really quite small minorities?
No, I think electoralism is really important, but that has to be paired with rights discourses. The Dean of Stanford Law some years ago, John Hart Ely, wrote a book called Democracy and Distrust. And the theme of it really was that courts in general shouldn't be interfering with the judgments of democratic majorities, which unfortunately the Supreme Court often does. It strikes down things like the Voting Rights Act. But that they really ought to be policing the boundaries of democracy for democratic failures, that is looking for areas where minority groups or underrepresented groups, or groups that just have lacked political power. And an obvious example of this is women are in the majority but have lacked political power dramatically in the US. That's a good role for courts and rights discourses. And I think that's true generally, that it's too pat to say just majoritarian electoralism is going to solve our problems. I mean, minority rule clearly doesn't work of a political minority, but protecting under politically disadvantaged minorities is really critical to getting electoralism to work properly. At least that's what I think.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any other comments? No?
No.
Okay.
In that case, well, thank you, everyone.
Is that
I really
somebody
appreciate
talking?
it.
No. Okay, yeah, no, I don't think there's any further questions coming up, just some thank yous in the chat. So yeah, just want to reiterate my thanks to you. I hope we will keep in touch and continue the conversation and and over the next while to come, and let's see what happens in the US over the next few years as well. That'd be really interesting and full of optimism, hopefully.
Yes. Well, thank you for the
Okay.
time. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
And for all GCU's good work. So talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.